By 1934, Soviet planners recognized the need to start working on a new strategic bomber. When Tupolev was given the project, he delegated it to one of his staff, Vladimir Petlyakov. The new design was pretty ambitious. It was a large, fairly modern, four-engined heavy bomber that included a significant bomb load, heavy defensive armament, and provisions for a fifth engine inside the fuselage dedicated to driving a supercharger system for the other four. The first prototype flew at the very end of 1936, but Stalin's purges seriously delayed the final phase of testing and development, as most of the key engineers and staff were unavailable, and it wasn't until 1939 that work continued in earnest to get the new plane ready for production. The new plane, initially called the TB-7, was fairly capable after some of the early design issues were resolved. For example, that whole thing with the fifth engine driving a supercharger didn't really work out very well. However, a problem cropped up almost immediately that was basically never solved all the way through the end of World War II. They just couldn't get reliable engines for this thing. Half a dozen models of engines were tried, and all of them had issues. Some gave better range but broke down more often, some wouldn't use commonly available fuel, some weren't available in sufficient quantity, some were underpowered, and some just didn't physically fit onto the airframe. As a result, published performance figures for this plane are usually describing just one engine variant, and sometimes one individual airframe, as there were a lot of improvised power plant modifications done out in the field by local crews. This new bomber was renamed Pe-8 in 1942 after Petlyakov died in a plane crash, and it was used not only for strategic bombing raids, but also as a morale booster to hit Berlin, similar to the United States' Doolittle raid on Tokyo after Pearl Harbor. Less than 100 Pe-8s were built, and in the end, it was only a minor part of the Soviet war effort, as the Eastern Front tended to focus more on tactical bombers than strategic bombers. What we get in Warthunder is the Pe-8, a long-range bomber in Rank 3 of the Soviet air tree at battle rating 4.3. This plane gets an optical bomb sight, carries 7 crew, including 5 gunners, and has 5 defensive turrets, including the 2 out on the wings behind the engines. Now, despite the quantity of gun positions, there are actually significant blind spots below and to the sides of the plane, but the rearward-facing firepower is quite strong. Now, for loadouts, the Pe-8 can take a variety of dumb bombs carried internally or on inner wing pylons, ranging from the Fab 50 up to the enormous Fab 5000, but it can't mix and match bomb sizes or types. Now, the heavy hitter with this plane is the Fab 5000. This absurd weapon weighs 5,000 kilograms and remains one of the largest bombs in the entire game. It has an enormous 105-meter blast radius and can destroy absolutely anything unfortunate enough to be even mildly close to the blast zone. In terms of flight performance, the Pe-8 is a big 4-engine prop bomber, but there's a little more to it than that. Now, this bomber is horribly unstable. It wobbles around pretty badly in turns, or really just even flying straight and level after recovering from a turn. Add to this, the controls are pretty heavy, even for a bomber, and it suffers really noticeable lockup at higher speeds. You've got to be pretty careful if you ever have to dive this thing. Now, the acceleration and rate of climb on this plane, along with its top speed, are all pretty unimpressive, mostly due to being a bit underpowered. Remember how I mentioned that they never really sorted out the engine issues in real life? Yeah, it looks like the snail decided to give us that in the game as well. Basically, any fighter that the Pe-8 is likely to go up against is going to be able to intercept it or run it down if they want to, and it's generally just kind of slow for its BR. There are a couple of high points though. First, believe it or not, the overall turning maneuverability and agility of the Pe-8 are noticeably above average for a 4-engine prop bomber. Now, that isn't to say it's good, it's just not as horrible. And you can sometimes use an aggressive maneuver to throw a fighter off for a few moments and maybe get them into the arc of your defensive turrets. Not often, but sometimes, and it's worth trying. The plane also gets combat flaps, but unfortunately no air brakes, which is something that really would help this plane. Structurally, the Pe-8 has a pretty sturdy airframe. It's got self-sealing fuel tanks, and it can sometimes absorb a surprising amount of damage before going down. It's built pretty tough. Taking the Pe-8 out in air battles will feel pretty familiar if you've done heavy bomber stuff before, but with a couple of notes. The defensive armament in the rear is quite strong, but only average in the front. So if you see someone coming to get you, consider trying to angle off so that your rear gunners can take a shot on them. You get enough ordnance to easily dispose of 2 or 3 bases in one sortie, depending on your bomb load, and despite its weaknesses, the Pe-8 is actually a fairly good points grinder, and it can be pretty handy for some of the score-based special events. Now, with that said, the Pe-8's reputation mainly comes from close air support, or more specifically, close air support using the Fab 5000 bomb. This thing is absolutely monstrous, and if you get a good drop on a cluster of targets, you can take out huge groups of enemy tanks even on a near miss. In the match you're watching right now, I got 8 kills on my first drop, then got shot down, but I had enough spawn points from the first drop to spawn into another Pe-8 and do another Fab 5000 drop for 6 more kills. However, you'll notice something unfortunate. Each drop managed to take out one friendly target who got too close, and I got kicked from the match for team killing as a result. That's actually a really important lesson, and I want to stress that if you take this thing out over ground battles, please try to communicate with your teammates. Ask them where the bomb is needed, tell them where you're going to put it, and when you drop, so that they can hopefully try to get the hell out of the blast zone. Now, I know that as Warthunder players, we have a reputation for being allergic to teamwork, but please just try. And similarly, if someone in a friendly Pe-8 lets you know in chat that a Fab 5000 is on its way into whatever, capture point, it's probably a good idea to clear the hell out and make some room. Visually, the Pe-8 is kind of a weird-looking bomber. The extended bulges under the engines for the turrets and the landing gear are pretty odd, and the narrow inline cockpit looks a bit out of place. But you get a few different available paint jobs, so that's a nice bonus. Overall, it's not bad, but still a fairly unusual looking plane. Landing the Pe-8 is worth practicing, as is normal for large bombers like this. You can drop gear at over 350 kilometers an hour and landing flaps at about 300, which simplifies the landing profile a bit, but it's still a huge cargo ship of a plane, so you're going to need to set up pretty long final approaches, and you're going to need to avoid maneuvering at lower speeds. Now, the cockpit on the Pe-8 is a low poly placeholder, but the visibility is actually really good for a large bomber, and the instruments are in easy to find spots. I found this plane easy to fly with the VR headset, even if the insides weren't very nice to look at. To close out on the Pe-8, this thing gets the Fab 5000 mini nuke. Oh, and its other bomb loads are pretty useful too. It has good defensive firepower directly to the rear, and it's fairly tough. However, it's underpowered, it's unstable, and you have to be pretty careful to avoid team kills when flying close air support. The final verdict on the Pe-8 is that this is easily one of the best mid-tier 4-engine bombers in terms of its offensive punch, but the flight performance might hold you back from being able to actually use that offensive punch. Still, the Fab 5000 is an amazing gimmick. As always, thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, check out this other one.